Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So for today, the saint for today is Saint Francis of Rome. She was a 14th century, born in 14th century Rome. I think probably, as usual with the saints, an extraordinary life, both married and a nun, eventually, as we will see. So she was born in 1384 in Rome to a noble family, and as a young girl wanted to give her life to God in a religious vocation as a nun. But her father had already arranged a marriage for her and refused to listen to her desire to give her life to God. So she wept about this bitterly. And as we know, parents, you should not frustrate your children's desire for a religious vocation. That is not proper to do, as Francis' father did. But her spiritual director told her, as she sat in there weeping about this, "Are you crying because you want to do God's will or because you want God to do your will?" So, rather interesting way of putting it. So she reluctantly accepted that this was God's will, at least contingently, you would say, like this is God's will in these circumstances. And so she was married to her husband at the age she was 13 years old at the time. Now her husband, he was a very good and a devout man. His name was Lorenzo. That's from St. Lawrence. That's a version of that. And he eventually would become the commander of the papal troops at Rome. And this would cause her much anguish later in life, as we'll see. But their marriage would last for 40 years. 40 years to a marriage that she didn't really want to begin with. And it was difficult for her. This quiet, shy 13-year-old girl, she was thrust into parties and banquets in high society. And her mother-in-law, especially, was very concerned about such matters. And she wanted young Francis to be as concerned about it as she was. And she just was not, didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so you can imagine for a girl at this age, it was too much for her. She had a breakdown of her physical health and her mental health as well, and she was bedridden for some months, like six or 7 months or something like that, and it almost killed her. But she recounts at this time, they're bringing in doctors and so on, and she's praying to God, and she has a vision, actually, of another saint, Saint Alexius, and he was Saint Alexius was a saint earlier, many hundreds of years earlier, and he appeared to her, and he chided her for a bad attitude and said that she needed to accept the vocation in which she found herself, and that God was giving her an important choice. Did she want to recover or not? And so she was finally able to say in his vision between herself and Saint Alexius, "God's will is my will." And then St. Alexius replied, "Then you will live to glorify his name." And so after this, once she was finally able to give up her desires and just do whatever God had put in front of her, she had a complete and miraculous recovery. So she tried to do these events as best she could, and her mother-in-law kept chiding her to be like her own daughter, which her name was Venoza, and said, "Why can't you be more like your sister-in-law? And she's around the same age as you, and she enjoys these parties and these amusements. You should be more like her and enjoy these worldly things." Frances could see the emptiness of it all, and at one point she went out into the little family. They were living in a big estate, house and servants and so on. And so Frances of Rome goes out and she weeps bitterly about her situation. Her sister-in-law, Venoza, comes to comfort her, and Frances pours out, "I hate these parties, I don't like this, I don't want to be here, I'd rather be a nun." Well, her sister-in-law, Venoza, tells her, "Me too. I don't want to be doing this either. I want a religious vocation. I'd rather be a nun, but this is where God has put me, and so I put on a brave face, I do as best I can, and I don't like these parties, but I pretend that I do, and I've learned to come to accept that." So a tremendous amount of virtue there. And Frances was convinced that she Venoza, her sister-in-law, she was convinced she was worldly and shallow. She found out quite the opposite. There was a lot of virtue going on there. So these two young girls became very close friends, and they worked out a program of devout practices and prayer that they could follow in the house when they did have their own time. So Frances, for her part, realized that her obligations to her family came first, even if that meant dressing up to her rank, making and receiving visits, doing it gladly, and putting on that you wouldn't say that front, but upholding the image of that noble family up there in Rome. But she and her sister-in-law also, they went to Mass together, visited prisons, served in hospitals, and they set up a private chapel in the household, and they often prayed there together. Now, she really displayed a tremendous amount of virtue for whenever she was at prayer or other spiritual exercises, which is what she wanted to be doing. If anybody called her away, her husband called for her or one of the servants, she would lay aside all to obey without delay. And she said, a married woman must, when called upon, quit her devotions to God at the altar and find him in her household affairs. All right, quite the mature saying for a girl of about 15 at this time. And God was pleased to show her the merit of her obedience, for it says it in the story of her life. It says that once she was called away 4 times, right when she was beginning to read the little office of the Blessed Virgin. She left right away 4 times in a row, and the 5th time she began to read from the office. It says that the letters were written in gold there, showing God's favor with that. Let's see. So when she was 16 years old, she finally had her first child, and she named him Battista, after St. John the Baptist. That same year, her mother-in-law also died, and the entire household, this giant estate, everybody wanted Frances to be the mistress of the house, and so she was. She administered it excellently. She was a good leader, a good administrator, and a kind employer to the servants. Now, this happened just in time for a flood hit the city of Rome and a huge famine following. And Frances was now the administrator of this large estate. And so, of course, she gave away food, clothing, wine, oil to all the poor persons there in the city. Her father-in-law, however, he wasn't really involved in managing, but he noticed that their stores and their resources were being depleted at a rapid pace, and he got furious when he found out that Frances was giving everything away. So he took away the keys from her, locked up all the storehouses, and then just to make sure she didn't give anything else away, he sold what provisions they had left and kept just enough for the family. So Frances was quite distraught about this, about the plight of these poor persons starving and so on in the city. And she would go out to the streets to beg. And she was so desperate for food, she went up to the family storehouse, what was left there, and she's picking through, trying to find any little pieces of corn or whatever there may be. And then she went down to the chapel and prayed to God. Well, her husband went upstairs to check, and he found the granary that had been empty. It was filled to the brim. Same thing in the cellar. They went down, and there was this cask of wine that was empty. It was filled to the brim. So at this miracle, because everybody knew they were running low, they were checking these things every single day, and so now they were suddenly full out of nowhere. So that completely converted St. Francis's converted her father-in-law and her husband. He was already good and pious, but they was like, okay, you can do whatever you want. And so she did. She got this newfound freedom. She sold her jewels, her fancy clothes, and she distributed the money to the needy, and she wore a much plainer dress at that point. So she was running a hospital out of a part of the house. She was giving away all these things. And all of this, and recall, she's now in a vocation she didn't want to be in the first place. Right? She wanted to be a nun, but she had to be, she ended up ending married. And look at all these good things that she's doing. How many people's lives were saved because of her acceptance of this station that she didn't want. But sadly, unfortunately, war would arise between the Pope in Rome and various anti-popes. This is going to be the early 1400s, so this is right at the height of the Great Western Schism. And there's three men claiming at one time to be Pope. And her husband, commander of the papal forces, there's an attack on the city, and he is captured. He and a number of other troops. And so as ransom for Lorenzo, captain of the guard, the enemy captain, he wants a ransom, and he asks for Lorenzo's firstborn son, Battista. And so Francis is told, you need to bring your 2-year-old boy, you need to give him up for ransom. It's horrifying, right? So she flees. She's going to run and hide, but her spiritual director stops her again and says, this is not, you have to do that. You need to go do this for the good of the city and your husband and so on. So, I mean, you can just imagine her anguish. She goes and gives up her little boy to these enemy soldiers. I mean, who knows what they're going to do to him? And she runs to the nearest church and just collapses weeping in front of a statue of the Blessed Virgin. And she consecrates the safety of her son to the Blessed Mother. Meanwhile, while she's doing this, the soldiers take her infant boy and they put him on a horse, and they're going to take him off to captivity. The horse that he was on wouldn't budge. They whipped it, they prodded it, the horse wouldn't move. So the soldiers themselves, this is kind of a testament to the religious piety of in the Middle Ages, even of people who were attacking each other. These enemy soldiers take this as a sign from God, and they return Battista to her mother that same morning. She's in church weeping to the Blessed Mother, and here comes her son right back to her. So quite a miraculous restoration there. But unfortunately, the wars would continue, and her husband at one point was exiled. Enemy troops returned. They attacked the city again, and her household, they had to flee, and the whole house was ransacked and ruined, left in complete destruction. But she returned. She and the servants, they did the best they could. She opened it now. She was no more doing anything in high society, for Rome at that point was ruined. Like wolves, it says, were roaming through the streets at some point. Famine, wars, floods. So she didn't have to worry about high society. So that was something she appreciated, and spent her time in hospitals, doing her home as a hospital, begging in the streets, giving to the poor, and so on. It's been some years, a couple of decades at this point, and she's really advanced in the spiritual life. So it says that she has the gift of healing, and over 60 people say they were healed by her intercession. She was given also the gift of miracles and ecstasy. She had revelations concerning purgatory and hell, and she foretold the end of the Western Schism. It said that she could read the secrets of consciences, and she could detect evil plots forming. And she was remarkable for her humility, her detachment, her obedience, and her patience. She also had the gift, an extraordinary gift, of seeing her guardian angel. And in fact, this was a trade. So she had, I think, 3 children, Battista, her oldest son, and then a boy and a girl. The little boy died at a young age of sickness. And then she had in the vision, her deceased little boy told her that his sister was going to die also, but that as a recompense, she was going to be given the vision of her guardian angel. And that occurred. So St. Francis of Rome lost 2 of her young children, but then was given an archangel, which remained for her the rest of her life as her guardian angel. And she could see and even conversed with him at some points. And an interesting interchange occurred once when this guardian angel told Francis to stop her severe penances of eating only bread and water and wearing a hair shirt. The angel said to her, "You should understand by now that the God who made your body and gave it to your soul never intended that soul should ruin the flesh and return it to him despoiled." So an interesting little admonition there from a guardian angel. But eventually, Francis's husband would be returned. He returned out of exile, but he'd been wounded so severely he would need her assistance throughout the rest of his life. I don't think he was bedridden, but he needed to be taken care of. For 40 years, as I mentioned, they were married, and her husband eventually died, and his last words to her were, "I feel as if my whole life has been one beautiful dream of the purest happiness. God has given me so much in your love." And thus he expired. After his death, Frances moved into a house she had established for holy women. So she had founded an order of other women who were living in the world but wanted to serve God. And so it was kind of like what St. Jane Frances de Chantal would do later. They were kind of visiting the poor and so on. They were praying prayers, but not living in cloister. So she founded that order, and eventually after her husband's death, she moved in and served as its superior. And she was 52 years old at this point. And finally, she was able to live the life of a nun that she had wanted to do since she was 11 years old. And here she was at 52. So she lived 4 more years in this, and she herself finally died. And she said her last words were that, "My guardian angel has finished his task, and he now beckons me to follow him." And so thus the life of St. Francis of Rome. Life doesn't always proceed according as we think. And was God's will for her? Was it to be a nun? Was it to be married? As we see, it was a little bit of both. But her first vocation, and I would say this is so important for anybody out there, and you want to know what's my vocation, if I could just find my vocation, your first vocation is to have a good attitude about where you are. Right? Having a bad attitude is going to ruin everything. That made her sick in the beginning. I don't want to go to parties. I don't want to do this. I want to be a nun. I don't want to be married. And she got sick and almost bedridden and almost died. Now, what would have happened if she had either died or stayed with a bad attitude? All those people she helped for the next 40 years wouldn't have gotten it. People would have died of the sickness, died of starvation, died of whatever. It was because she had a good attitude at the beginning that changed everything. And that's what I would really want to say. That's really the takeaway point from the life of St. Francis of Rome, and the ecstasies and the visions and all these things she had. It stemmed from her acceptance of events she couldn't control. She couldn't control the fact you have an arranged marriage, your father's not going to change his mind, that's the way it is in 1400s Italy. She accepted that. And look at the good that came from it. So let that be a lesson to us. If we're like, oh, if only I could be in a convent, if only I could get married, if only I could find my husband, oh, if only. Well, how about if only you had a good attitude? Let's start there first, and then maybe your vocation will follow. And I tell you, the same people that complain about not having a vocation, those are going to be the same ones years later. Oh, I hate my convent, I hate my husband, oh, whatever. That's how it happens. Don't have a bad attitude. Wherever you are, whatever is happening to you, everybody's first vocation in life is to be cheerful about what God sends them. And whether you missed your vocation or not, you can see God can change anything. Are you supposed to be a nun? Are you supposed to be married? Whatever. Are you supposed to be a priest or a monk? Who knows? What you're supposed to do, as I mentioned, is accept what comes, have a good attitude, be cheerful, and strive for happiness. Happiness is a choice. We decide, right? It's our choice. Am I going to be happy with what God has given me or not? Happiness is not about the externals, it's about the inside. So let us look at what even St. Francis, she was surrounded by people who had that same attitude. Her husband, imagine a man being able to say that to his wife. I feel as if my whole life has been one beautiful dream of the purest happiness. God has given me so much in your love. Boy, if only, you married women, your husband can say that on his deathbed because of how you have been, your sanctity and so on. So quite an example. This is why it's so important to know the saints and know their stories, because these are the people that we look up to. These are the people who lived in the same circumstances that you're in right now. She lived that same thing. And look at what she did with her life. Look at how she responded to hardship and sacrifice and toil. And if she did it, you can do it. Because God is giving us all, not the same graces, but the same God is available to all of us. We can respond in the same way, as generously as we can. So let us make that resolve, and let us look to the saints for those examples. Happiness, holiness, sanctity is possible for everybody, no matter what the circumstances. Whether you think you missed your vocation or not, sanctity is possible. St. Francis of Rome, pray for us. God bless you all. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.